Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us here today. We're about to get started, and the welcome is going to be given by our president, Reginald DeRoche.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you all of you for being here. We've escaped the weather for now. We're expecting some rain coming in, but it looks like it's a little further south, so I think we're good. And for those of you from outside of Houston, this is actually a very cool day for us, and so thank you, Earl, for bringing that Michigan cool weather down here. To begin with, I want to thank our moderator, Faye, and our speakers, Gary, Patricia, and Susan, for participating in today's discussion. Your work and expertise in the areas of affirmative action, diversity, equity, and inclusion is valued and truly esteemed. We look forward to hearing your thoughts on these issues, specifically how the Supreme Court's landmark decision to overturn affirmative action has affected universities and other organizations across our country. Tonight's topic is weighing heavily on the minds of people like me who are deeply invested in making higher education accessible to everyone. Rice and many other universities across the country are at the cusp of matriculating their first class since the Supreme Court's ruling last summer that prevents universities from considering an applicant's race as one of countless important factors in the admissions application. These classes could represent another inflection point in the work of furthering the ways that universities can and should function as the most powerful engines of equality and opportunity in America. Like many other higher education institutions across the US, Rice has made progress in creating a more diverse student population. That progress, again, much like other institutions, has been slow. Although women students were welcomed since Rice's inception in 1912, the percentage of women students was small. The same can be said for other historically underrepresented minorities such as Hispanics and Asians. Blacks, however, were prohibited from going to Rice until the early 1960s. The first black student enrolled in 1964, a mathematics graduate student, Raymond Johnson Lewis. Johnson ended up having a long and distinguished career as a math professor at University of Maryland, recently retired. I had the opportunity to have lunch with Dr. Johnson 2 years ago, and he actually came to campus earlier this year. And he would recount how everybody thought he was either Puerto Rican or Indian, which allowed him to survive as the only black student at Rice at that time. In fall of 1965, the first two black undergraduate students arrived, Charles Edward Freeman III and Jacqueline Elizabeth Macaulay. Today, fortunately, things look drastically different at Rice and many other institutions. Last year's matriculating class, for example, had no single ethnic or racial majority, and 32% of our students were from underrepresented groups, and another 13% were international students, representing 53 states and territories in more than 47 countries. And several matriculating classes before that looked similarly. As you can see, we have made great gains in the long term because of the growing commitment to diversity and inclusion and the growing understanding of their value to innovation and excellence at the university. The pathways taken to our present have not always been smooth and have often required rethinking, regrouping, and even new thinking. The questions at the heart of this evening's conversations are along the same lines. How do we continue supporting college access for students from traditionally marginalized communities? How do we educate and develop transformative, equity-driven leaders? And how do we keep the ball rolling towards progress versus back in time, or going back in time? So to conclude, I want to recognize and thank Dr. Earl Lewis, the founding director of the Center for Social Solutions and professor of history at the University of Michigan. Dr. Lewis founded the center in 2018 while he was president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and exploring the value of diversity in a wide range of social, economic, cultural, and educational contexts. He and the center have become a focal point of knowledge around a variety of issues regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion. And last but not least, I want to thank Dr. Alex Bird, Vice Provost for DEI at Rice, Yesenia Montoya, Assistant Vice Provost for DEI, and Heather Holly, the Office of DEI, for helping plan and organize this extremely important event. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lewis. Dr. Lewis is the Thomas C. Hult Distinguished University Professor of History, Afro-American and African Studies and Public Policy, and the founding director of the University of Michigan Center for Social Solutions. From March 2013 to 2018, he served as president of the Andrew Mellon Foundation and also previously was the first Black provost of Emory University. I've gotten to know Earl through the Academic Leadership Institute, ALI, which he co-founded with Dwight McBride to increase the representation of rising leaders committed to issues of DEI, including faculty of color, on track to becoming future presidents and provosts. And I can say in the short time that ALI has existed, it's had a huge impact on the number of faculty of color who have moved on to leadership roles. So Earl, we are honored to have you here with us again, and we look forward to your remarks. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Okay, let's try that again. Good evening. There we are. Okay, great. There's something about the brain that changes. I've come to understand if you engage in a little call and response. And so it's a delight to be back at Rice, and it's only a few years ago where I came to deliver a series of lectures, and I was trying to remember where the College of Humanities is relative to this auditorium, and I think I was pointed in the right direction. As you've already heard, I have the privilege of actually serving as the founding director of the Center for Social Solutions at the University of Michigan. And part of what we have here today is part of work that we actually started, not in 2018, but actually in 2012. And so in December of 2012, there was a convening at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation just prior to my taking on the presidency, where we invited scholars, policymakers, and others to actually think through the implications of a world post-Grutter and Gratz, post-Hopwood, and trying to anticipate where we would go and where we were going. This is before the most recent SCOTUS decision. And at that point, we decided that there weren't enough people who actually understood the value between diversity and democracy. And it's as a result of that conversation on a December day in the Upper East Side of Manhattan that the series Our Compelling Interest was born. And not only the book series that's published by Princeton University Press, but also the actual events and activities that are part of that effort to talk about the importance of diversity and democracy. And so here we are today with the title, In the Wake of Affirmative Action. And what we've come to understand that is important in this conversation, that diversity and democracy, in our view, is related to the whole idea of a prosperous society. And as we think through prosperity, it brings us back to the question then, what does it mean? It means that we first have to figure out how to define diversity. What is it? How do we define it? What's the implications? But once we've defined diversity, we didn't need to figure out how to leverage diversity. And leveraging it then allows us to think through how it relates to the creation and the maintenance of this prosperous democracy. And then defining, leveraging means then we also have to figure out how to value diversity. Because I think we can argue in this particular moment, we can define it, we can leverage it, but in more and more sectors of American life and society, we may not be valuing the importance of diversity. And so that interplay between defining, leveraging, and valuing is what brings us here today to be part of this conversation. The OCI series has resulted in 4 books to date being published. The inaugural Our Compelling Interest volume, the diversity bonus, now I have to put on my glasses because I didn't read my own writing. out of many faiths, and the walls around opportunity. Those are the 4 that have been published to date, and a 5th volume will appear this coming September, October, and that one will deal with higher admissions. And so we'll go back to the idea of testing and merit and how we think about this relationship to the value of diversity. The OCI series was co-founded by my colleague Nancy Cantor, who is the outgoing chancellor of Rutgers Newark and about to become president of Hunter College in New York City. And she and I and others have been part of this conversation. And we look forward to what you're about to hear. And to actually orchestrate and to moderate and to enable this conversation, it's my pleasure to introduce Faye Yarbrough, who I think many in this room already know, but for those who don't, and she is an alum of Emory University, where you've heard at one point in my life I was provost. She is currently the William Gaines Twyman Professor of History and Associate Dean for Faculty and Graduate Programs here at Rice University. The author of several books, Choctaw Confederates, The American Civil War in Indian Country, also Race and the Cherokee Nation, Sovereignty in the 19th Century, as well as several edited volumes, and one I think that's due out, a co-edited volume that's due out soon, Empires and Indigenous Peoples. And so Faye will have both the challenge and opportunity of taking this incredible panel of colleagues and friends and helping them to help us understand where we are in the wake of decisions regarding affirmative action. Faye, thank you. And to Susan, Gary, and Patricia, thank you as well.
Thank you, Earl, for that generous introduction, and thank you to all of the audience members for being here today in what I don't think our guests realize how scary the weather was predicted to be this afternoon, so I especially appreciate the audience members who came in person, given that. We appreciate that you want to join us for this conversation in the wake of affirmative action, co-sponsored by Rice University's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office and the Center for Social Solutions at the University of Michigan. Our panelists will discuss the impact that the SCOTUS decision on affirmative action is having on leadership at institutions of higher education and other organizations. I'm fortunate that I have 3 very eminent interlocutors today. These scholars are part of the book series that Earl mentioned, Democracy and Diversity from the Our Compelling Interests Initiative. Gary's paperback is here, and I didn't ask Gary ahead of time, I think he's willing to sign copies for you in the audience. Nick Lemon's book features Patricia's piece, and that's the book that's slated for fall. And Susan's book is scheduled for March 2025. So I'll begin by introducing each of our panelists with a little bit more detail, and then we'll have each of them speak for a few minutes about their work before we move on to some of the questions that I have for them. So Gary Orfield is Distinguished Research Professor of Education, Law, Political Science, and Urban Planning at the University of California, Los Angeles. His research interests are in the study of civil rights, education policy, urban policy, and minority opportunity. He was co-founder and director of the Harvard Civil Rights Project, and now serves as co-director of the Civil Rights Project Proyecto de Derechos Civiles at UCLA. He's the author of the 4th volume in the series, The Walls Around Opportunity, The Failure of Colorblind Policy for Higher Education. Patricia Gándara holds a PhD in educational psychology and is research professor and co-director of the Civil Rights Project with Gary. And her research interests are in educational equity and access for low-income and ethnic minority students, language policy, and the education of Mexican origin youth. She has been a commissioner of post-secondary education for the state of California and has directed education research in the California legislature. Patricia is a commenter on Volume 5, which is the volume that Earl referenced on higher admissions, the rise and fall of standardized testing. And then our third panelist is Susan Sturm. She is the George M. Jaffin Professor of Law and Social Responsibility and the founding director of the Center for Institutional and Social Change at Columbia Law School. Her work focuses on inequality, discrimination, remedying racial and gender bias, criminal justice reform, lawyer leadership, and the role education can play in creating social change and a more inclusive world. The forthcoming volume, am I allowed to say this title? Have you decided, have you landed on this one?
Tell me what it is and I'll tell you.
Okay, the working title that I have is What Might Be, Finding Transformative Power in the Struggle to Undo Racism. Do you think that's where we're?
Close enough.
Okay. I mean, that's a pretty provocative title just based on the audience response, right? So again, I have some questions for our panelists today, and we are going to try to leave 15 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. But first, we'd like each of them to talk about their contribution to the series. So if we could start, we didn't sit in order, but we'll start with Gary.
Okay, are we doing it in place?
Sure.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Did you turn on your microphone?
Is the green light on? Let's see.
Should have a little on-off button on there.
I don't know where your on-off button is.
We overcome all obstacles.
There you go.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
A person of all
Okay.
seasons.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I was thinking about when I've been here to Rice before and been around Houston. First time was when President Carter's administration was suing Houston Independent School District, and I was their expert witness. One of the things that you may not know about is that the Houston city expanded immensely over the generations, but the school district stopped expanding in an interesting year, 1954. The Carter administration believed that was clearly unconstitutional, and it produced a kind of segregation and inequality in education that was tremendous. As soon as Ronald Reagan was elected, the case was dropped. I was also here about 20 years ago when we did a regional dropout project. All over the country, we did projects on the dropout statistics, which almost in all states were fraudulent at the time. And this work contributed a lot to the efforts to focus on dropouts around the country, which has actually improved quite a lot since that period, but still has a way to go. Houston is a very important city. Texas is a critical part of the whole story of racial inequality and possibility. So it's a pleasure to be here. We're a country that celebrates the Brown decision at the end of segregation and inequality, but never did it. It was implemented seriously 10 years after the Brown decision. 98% of black students in the United States were still in completely segregated schools. It was seriously implemented only during the Johnson administration. And Richard Nixon put a hard stop on that effort as he changed the Republican Party to identify with the racist South, take up some of George Wallace's political support that has worried him. So we are a country that has really, the reality of our country is separate but equal. There were 19 states that set up separate colleges, public colleges for students of color, and really didn't allow any significant number to enter the major colleges and universities until the Civil Rights Revolution in the 1960s. We're a country that's in fundamental racial change now. A substantial majority of young people in this country are not white. But the inequality that we've always had is profound. And colleges are one of the fundamental mechanisms that perpetuates inequality between generations, or that we try to use to change it. But so far, we haven't really had a great deal of success in aggregate. The Civil Rights Project was founded in 1996, the year that affirmative action was ended in Texas under the Hopwood decision, and in California under Proposition 209. At that time, we decided that we brought together people who were leaders of education, civil rights, research, and so forth, and we found that people had no plan B about what to do. And the reason we created the Civil Rights Project was to help people understand the dynamics of the inequality and to be a force for bringing the best possible research to bear on the most important issues of racial inequality. We were deeply, deeply involved in the University of Michigan case that came to the Supreme Court, and the Moderator decision in 2003 that really saved affirmative action for 20 years. But basically, the courts have become more and more reactionary. We have had 52 years in a row of domination of the Supreme Court by Republican appointees. And they've become consistently more far right in their orientation, as you can obviously tell from some of the current decisions that are going on. The affirmative action case that was decided last year is, of course, one of the basic ways in which that was expressed. We are a long way from where we need to be. Affirmative action was very important because there was almost no diversity in elite colleges until affirmative action came along. In 19 states, they were required to come up with state plans to diversify under the Civil Rights Act. But as soon as Ronald Reagan got in power, they stopped serious enforcement of those efforts. In the rest of the country, it was a voluntary action by colleges. Almost all of the elite colleges in the country adopted some form of affirmative action. It has never been really securely supported by our courts. The first major decision came in 1978 with Bakke, and that decision basically said affirmative action was okay, but under a very limited way, and the purpose was not to make up for a history of inequality. It was to create diverse classes, because Harvard Committee had decided that diverse classes were more effective educationally. We commissioned a lot of research to show how that actually works. And it turns out that, of course, diverse classes are much more effective educationally. They have powerful influence on all groups of students. And that evidence was put in the briefs to the Supreme Court in the Michigan case, and it was recognized in the decision in the Grutter case in 2003. But conditions became worse. There were 2 University of Texas cases, the 2 Fisher cases, where a billionaire found a student who would bring a case against the University of Texas, and it went to the Supreme Court twice. In both of those cases, in 2013, 2016, the Supreme Court upheld affirmative action, but only by 1 vote. So the stage was set when President Trump got 3 appointments to the Supreme Court and chose them from the really far right of the range of Republican possible nominees, and that they were put on the court. And basically the same thing that happened to the abortion precedents happened to the affirmative action cases. Affirmative action had had to meet the obstacles of showing that there was a compelling interest and that the programs were narrowly designed to consider race only to the extent that it was necessary to accomplish that compelling interest. And the compelling interest was the interest of integration and interracial classes and learning together, which it was a central compelling interest. And actually, the research world produced a great deal of findings that were very powerful in those discussions. But when the case came up from Harvard University and the University of North Carolina, that was decided in 2023, there was just a radical attack on affirmative action. They dismissed the idea that there was a compelling interest. They didn't even care about discussing it. They simply defined affirmative action as racism against white people, basically. That's what the majority in the Supreme Court decision said. We have recently commissioned a projection that goes to 2050. Our projection shows that if the current patterns continue, there will be no progress on black college completion by the middle of the century. And it will be worse without affirmative action, because 75% of the selective colleges in the country were practicing affirmative action in one way or another. And it did make a difference. When the case went to the Supreme Court in the Harvard and UNC case, there was a tremendous mobilization of research from around the country. Over 1,000 scholars signed on to one of the briefs that in both the Harvard and the University of North Carolina cases. I wrote most of the brief of the National Academy of Education. We put before the court really compelling evidence that if they ended affirmative action, there would not be a workable alternative, that we would lose. There are things that could be done, but there wasn't anything that worked as well as affirmative action, and all of them are much more expensive than affirmative action was. So we also showed in many ways that there had been educational gains, substantial educational gains from affirmative action. In the decision, and you all should read it, it is discussed in the afterword of this volume that you picked up. What the court said was it didn't discuss the precedents. All the precedents up until this time were that affirmative action was okay in a limited way. But the Chief Justice, who was a young lawyer in the Reagan administration, has consistently been a bitter opponent of affirmative action and race-conscious remedies. And what he said was that this was just discrimination. This was not something you had to think about results for. There was no discussion in the majority opinion about what the effects would be. They weren't interested in that information. They said the issues about whether there were benefits were so complicated that they couldn't reach any decision on that, so they just ignored those. And they didn't try to link it with other decisions. They just said that the affirmative action decisions had been wrong always for the last 50 years, and that they knew what the truth was. And that it was not about a substitute, it was about forbidding. And that was the decision that was made in Harvard and UNC cases. Now, the basic reality that you read about in this book, if you read it, I really recommend it. If you read it, I'll send you a Starbucks. But the basic argument of the book is that the history of higher education in the country has been, up until the time of the Civil Rights Revolution, a history of exclusion of students of color. It wasn't ambiguous. They just weren't there. At the time of the Brown decision, only about 20% of black students in the South were even finishing high school. Aside from the small, more than 100 black colleges and universities, historic black colleges and universities, there had been almost no access to college in a serious way. So what we showed in these struggles is that every aspect of the path to college was unequal. The book quotes studies that go from prenatal care to preschool to the quality of teachers in early grades, to the experience of teachers, to the tragedy that happens to students when they go and through the 9th grade and into high school, and many began to flunk and detach from any serious possibility of higher education. Higher education, the book argues, has not just one basic wall, the wall of getting admitted, but two others that are equally important. One of them is preparation. We have nothing like equal preparation for college in our country. We recently published a study this summer, you can see on the website of the Civil Rights Project, that shows American schools are more segregated by race and by poverty than they have been since the late 1960s. That all of the progress that we've made on that has been lost. And that Black and Latino students are concentrated in very concentrated poverty schools with less prepared teachers, more limited curriculum, peer groups that are much less prepared, and that all of these things accumulate. So one of the things that I'm arguing in this book and then afterward is that if we can't address affirmative action directly, we need to really have higher education become a much more powerful voice for equalizing preparation. Because, you know, if you actually look seriously at the data, there isn't AP opportunities, not decent ones in most schools of color. There isn't good counseling into college. There isn't good information for college. There is a series of barriers that are obvious and very severe, and higher education basically doesn't address them systematically. Higher education separates itself from preparation. If we're going to deal with affirmative action, we have to deal with preparation. If we can't consider race directly to make up in some way for the extremely unequal preparation that we have. The other barrier, of course, is money. We made a decision in the 1980s to transfer the support of public higher education to a considerable extent from state governments to students. And the cost of that has been to escalate the cost of college enormously. And that is just a fundamental barrier. So if you're going to think about moving past affirmative action, which we don't have any choice about as long as we have this Supreme Court sitting, hopefully a couple of these members could be removed on ethical charges, but until that happens, we're going to be stuck with this decision. So we have to think hard about preparation, and we have to think hard about affordability. Because without affirmative action, and with these two other walls still in place, we are in very bad shape. The Pell Grant, at its peak in the 1970s, funded 3/4 of the cost of a four-year public university. Now it funds about 30% of the cost. Most states have nothing that can make up those differences. So for millions of kids who are thinking about college, they and their families are facing a situation where there really isn't a financial path that they can find. And that's obscene in terms of a society where almost all the major economic gains in our society in the last half-century have gone to people with post-secondary education. If we're not going to figure out a way to get people into post-secondary education and through post-secondary education, we're just going to perpetuate the inequality that we have existing in our society. And instead of being an inequality of a minority, it's going to be an inequality of the majority. For in the West, for example, there are now far more Latino students than white students. There are substantially more Asian students than Black students. And we are going through a huge change without any plan. So higher education is a central lever for making this happen, for perpetuating it. And it has to be attacked systematically if we're going to come out with anything that would be the kind of society that actually offers equal opportunity in a way that will be reasonably available to students of color. We need this to be debated all of the time. I was reading Lincoln's response to Dred Scott yesterday. Lincoln became famous, and his party rose to power partly by saying the Supreme Court had made decisions about slavery that were simply unacceptable, that did not represent the precedents, that were not thought through, and that although it was necessary to obey them, it wasn't necessary to accept them. And he pledged himself, and when he became president, he worked very hard to expand the Supreme Court, to limit its jurisdiction, and so forth. So we have to think about fundamental questions like that. If we don't want to be a society that just perpetuates an existing system of stratification and denies the future majority a reasonable set of opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you. I fear Gary may have answered the whole panel and all of our questions with that really thorough history and accounting of decisions that have led us to this particular moment. Patricia, would you talk a little bit about your contribution to the series, your response to the fifth volume in the series?
Sure. So the fifth volume, which is titled, I just found out, Higher Admissions, The Rise, Decline, and Return of Standardized Testing by Nicholas Lehman, links the issues around standardized testing with affirmative action and access to higher education. In this particular book, he builds on a book that he wrote almost 25 years ago called The Big Test. And many of you may know it. It's a classic in the field, The Big Test. But he extends, in this volume, he extends that work to talk about, so what do we do now? Now that we know what how the test came to have the importance that it has, what do we do? So Lehman, in writing at a moment when many highly competitive universities were dropping their requirements for the SAT or the ACT, suggested that this could lead us into using different kinds of tests that would help the great mass of students to access opportunity more equitably by showing where students had unmet needs or making more clear to them and their teachers what they needed to master. Unfortunately, as he was writing this book, many of the elite colleges started to re-up the SAT and change their policies. It's kind of like the more things change, the more they stay the same. I do not disagree with Lehman about the use of other kinds of tests, but I'm a bit more skeptical than he, perhaps, that the tests that we have now, whether they're achievement tests, a criterion reference test, or any others, necessarily result in more equitable outcomes, as long as there are stakes associated with those tests. At bottom, test results reflect the education that we provide for students, and that education, as Gary has been talking about, is grossly unequal, from preschool to high school. Until we fix that problem, test scores of whatever tests of all kinds will reflect that inequality. And until we disentangle test scores from notions of merit, we will be stymied in our efforts. We have reified test scores to be the definition of merit. Who deserves admission? And of course, this is where we get really entangled with affirmative action, as this has very serious consequences. The tests have been used as a tool in court cases to dismantle affirmative action. They have resulted in students with lower test scores losing scholarships and access to programs and majors, not just admissions. The impact goes beyond just admissions. And what has worried me most, and partly on research that I've done, is that the tests create a situation in which students see themselves as less able and therefore taking themselves out of the game. This has not been talked about as much, but we have evidence that this is, and I'll come back to that in a moment, that this is really having an impact on who even applies for higher education. Lehman also argues for shifting the focus away from what elite colleges with only 3 or 4% of students do about admissions to considering the ways in which we can better serve the great majority of students who are attending relatively non-selective colleges, often failing to get degrees. This makes a certain amount of sense, but I would argue that we cannot ignore the policies of these highly selective institutions because they shape policy for all the rest of us. Where were our Supreme Court justices educated? In the Ivies. And they have a profound influence on all of our lives. The same is true for many of the individuals who run the country and our economy. And we're now seeing a return to the use of these tests, which has this reflective impact throughout the culture. I titled my commentary on the Lehman book as A California Perspective, because we've recently been through these debates. And although, well, we've recently been through these debates and we have almost 3 decades now of operating without affirmative action. We have eliminated the use of, however, although we are the most selective public university system, we have eliminated the use of the SAT, ACT tests. Not only are we the most selective institution, but UCLA and Berkeley have the most applicants of any other public university, period. At UCLA this last year, we had 146,000 applicants. And we were told that it was not reasonable to eliminate the tests in face of so many applicants with extremely high GPAs and academic markers that made it difficult to distinguish among applicants. Now, I will tell you at this point, I was very active in the office of the president of the university at the time that we lost affirmative action in California and worked with a small committee of people to figure out what can we do now. Nothing of what we did was essentially as successful as it needed to be. But then coming around another almost 30 years, or 25 years at that point, I was on the committee to determine whether we should go forward with the use of the SAT or not, and the ACT. And so I was on the small writing committee to pull this together for policy purposes. What has been the fallout of getting rid of the SAT, ACT? Well, the admissions people had found a way, although they had told us in hearings that it simply couldn't be done because we had too many applicants and we had to make distinctions between too many applicants who looked essentially the same, that they needed those data and it was already in place. So we were told that this would be virtually impossible to do. But what happened as a result of us doing this? The admissions people somehow found a way to forego the test scores by concentrating on 13 factors, which include GPA, the rigor of courses taken, but also things like overcoming obstacles in one's life, the quality of the education provided by their schools, special talents that the students might have, including command of other languages, community service activities, and evidence of leadership. So this all then became part of the mix of what we were looking at without the test scores. The highest number of students of color ever to have applied to the University of California in its history came in the year that we got rid of the tests. So the tests appear to have had a dampening effect on these students making applications to the university. Take away the tests, and people were more confident to make an application to the university. We had written about this, but the evidence was clear once we took away the tests. It has not, what we are doing now in California has not solved the problem of inequality of opportunity, but it has made a dent. And hopefully it has established that the test is not critical for admissions purposes. I'll just end by saying that I think we also need to deal with the whole notion of merit. We need to redefine it. What does it mean to be merit-worthy for purposes of admissions? Conventional notions of meritocracy often attach the label of merit to people. People are meritorious. But it can be argued, and has been argued, that the designation should instead be applied to actions. An action is meritocratic if it promotes a valued societal goal, which can in fact be equality of opportunity. Thank you.
And lastly, Susan.
So how are you all doing? Feeling a little heavy-hearted, maybe? You know, this is a lot to hold, and so many of the challenges that we've heard described are challenges that may seem beyond our reach. We work in institutions. We work in spaces where we have contact day in and day out. And so the book that I have written, am still writing, finishing, is really meant for those of us who are working at the level of institutions to say, how do we move forward with hope in the face of despair? How do we move forward with the enormity of these problems when we know we need to take one step at a time? How many of you have experienced feeling like we're making change, things are really moving forward, and then somehow we end up right back where we started, right? Seeming like we haven't moved. Have any of you experienced that? And many of us have experienced that, right? I call that Groundhog Day, right? We go through the same thing, 24 hours later, there we are again, right? So the book that I have written is really, first of all, to try to understand why do we keep getting stuck? And on some level, of course, it's so obvious. It's because we live in a racist country. That's why we keep getting stuck. But we need to take it to a level where we can manage with it. So identify these paradoxes, these three different paradoxes that are not only the paradoxes of racism, but the paradoxes of trying to address race, the paradoxes of anti-racism. One of them is the paradox of racialized power. And I say that even in writing this book as a white woman, right? Writing a book as a white woman dealing with race, I have to both be willing to step back from and share power in order to actually transform. And I also need to step up and take responsibility and exercise the power that I have. We need to know step up and step back. And I've heard similar challenges of my colleagues of color grappling with this paradox of racialized power. There's the paradox of racial salience. And I think we've really heard about the Supreme Court has made this a paradox that sometimes we can't even escape, which is that we need to address race in order to be able to deal with it. We cannot deal with racism if we don't acknowledge it and study it and name it in the way that Gary's book so powerfully does. And at the same time, if we only focus on race, and if we name the problem only in terms of racism, we're going to push out some of the people who really need to be part of the process in order to make change. And we are going to also only deal with issues of race when in fact these problems are also include gender and class, and we need to think about these problems intersectionally. So we have to both name race and not name race. We'd have to address our problems and deal with anti-racism by talking about race, and also by talking in universal terms that will bring everyone to the table. That's the paradox of racial salience. And then we have the paradox of racialized institutions, and we've just heard so powerfully the discussion here of higher education as a great example. Higher education are supposed to be, and claim the mantle of being the drivers of mobility, the drivers of equity, the drivers of possibility, creating spaces that I think look at this room where we actually can come together and use the space of higher education to push for democracy, to push for a better society. And at the same time, as we have heard, higher education institutions are the drivers of inequality, the preservers of privilege. And I am in a law school. I came to law school because I wanted to pursue racial justice. And what are some of the institutions that are preserving racial inequality and are the face of racism? The law. So here we have the same institution that is the driver of racial justice and equity that is also the purveyor of racial injustice. So we have, what do we do with these paradoxes? We can't escape them, and we cannot avoid them if we really want to make change. So we have to learn how to hold them. We have to learn how to understand them. We have to learn how to navigate them. And so the book is really about really trying to learn from people who have done that. What does it look like to hold these paradoxes? It turns out that the first step is, in the face of these profound contradictions, to say, you know what? We're not going to resolve them. We have to learn to hold them. And I watch people, particularly my students, say a kind of a breath of relief. I don't have to pick one side or the other. I'm going to have to try to learn how to hold both sides of these paradoxes. And then we have to move towards, well, okay, what do we do? So in addition to the humility that comes along with acknowledging these uncertainties and these contradictions, there is building a cadre of people, I call them organizational catalysts, but communities of people who can bridge these divides and who can mobilize communities of people to actually drive change. And we learn from each other. So we have the Earl Lewises, and we have the Freeman Rabowskis, and we have the Alejo Rodriguez's, someone who I work very closely with, who I get to write about in the book, who's someone who spent 32 years in prison. The product of the failed opportunity systems that I think we've been hearing about, and has now become a bridge, who's been the most profound builder of communities that can transform the criminal legal system of anyone that I've seen. He's a paradigmatic organizational catalyst. Then there's the idea of taking small steps towards big changes, zooming in to where we can make change, and then zooming out and seeing the whole depressing picture of the enormity of the problem, and then zooming back in where we can actually make those kinds of changes. And here I really build on the work of, any of you have read Adrienne Marie Brown, Emergent Strategy, talking about fractals, building micro spaces of justice, micro spaces of democracy, where we actually create the world right now that we want to see. Seems impossible out there, but it's doable in this space. And then we connect with each other, and we mobilize across institutions to be able to push for the kinds of institutional changes that I think we've heard Gary and Patricia saying we need. That's not going to come from the top down. It's going to come from building institutions that actually move in this kind of transformative direction. And that means figuring out how we stay in this for the long haul, how we build communities of people that are not going to give up in the face of the current Supreme Court, that are going to find this kind of connection across these different communities, that are going to change who gets to make decisions. And so I have a chapter that's about repurposing power and how that's a really critical aspect of this work, and seeing how you can take the high points of transformative possibility as the moments where you can rewire how power is exercised, so that when we get into moments like it seems like we're in right now, we have our hands, hands tied to the mast of sharing power. Because I really think the only way that transformation is going to happen is by getting people into positions of influence who really deeply care about these kinds of questions and are part of the decision making to reshape our institutions. I have a feeling a number of you in the room are people who are doing this work in this institution, in this state, where it's not so easy. And I think that's where the hard work really has to be done. Thank you.
Okay, So seriously, I shared questions with them ahead of time, and so all of the panelists have kind of gone through my questions and answered them, right? So one of the things I was going to ask about is how we continue to support college access for students, which is a part of the theme of the panel. And we've gotten a lot of good examples of what can happen. Patricia, with what happens when standardized testing isn't used in admissions. Gary's discussion of how if we don't have affirmative action, then we need to think about preparation and also access in terms of how students pay for their education. Another part of this theme that we wanted to discuss today was then how do we educate and develop transformative and equity-driven leaders in this particular moment? So I wondered if each of our panelists wanted to say anything more about that, about how we can, in two ways, think about our students as potential future leaders, but then also how we can develop among because we're at a university, right? I'm not going to ask you how to train politicians, but how also to think about in terms of our university leadership, how to encourage them to also be transformative and equity driven, because it's not always the case that's true, right? So those two questions, how we might think about our students and training and educating them to be thinking about these issues, but then also how we might look towards our own university administration and how we could work with them in that way as well. So I don't know if someone wants to jump in the fray first. Gary's looking at you, Patricia.
Well, I think it's interesting for people to know that there was a great deal of debate among the people trying to make this decision about whether to go forward with the tests or not. But what finally turned, it was the regents. The regents of the university overruled the faculty that was very divided, and determined that there would not be the use of the standardized tests any further. The regents, at this moment in time, reflect the people of the state of California in its composition. So we had people of color among the regents, which is why I say that I think it is terribly important for us to remember where we're educating people who are going to have powerful positions, and how we do that so that they can use that power.
Gary or Susan?
You know, it's been my experience constantly that there are many people worrying about these issues, trying to think about what they can do, wanting to do something. And I think one of the things to think about in terms of response to the Supreme Court decision, you think about how women have responded to the abortion decision. They did not accept it. They went and passed propositions all over the country. They've terrified the Supreme Court enough so that it recently took a pass on making this even worse. It's very important to organize and to bring this into politics. And Texas, political change in Texas, if it comes, will change the entire United States. It's that big and that important. If you look in California in the 1980s and early 90s, it was a very racist Republican Party that was controlling it. They were passing propositions, limiting rights under the state constitution, doing all kinds of things. Eventually, they got defeated in the 1998 election. They haven't been able to elect anybody to a statewide office since then. You know, really thinking about state politics is very, very important.
And local politics.
Yeah, what Stacey did in Georgia was hugely transformative, even for the United States Congress. You know, I think you need to think, we're a democracy. Ultimately, politics matters a lot. And of course, Texas has a majority of non-white young people. They need to get organized. they really need to get organized and go out and raise hell and not accept these kinds of things. This is, you know, I grew up in the 60s. We organized everything. My first research project was a study that showed that quite a few students at the University of Minnesota would have to drop out if there was a tuition increase. We took it to the state legislature, they voted down the tuition increase. Because we had data and we were organized and we did protests. You know, we need to think about mobilizing our energy, the energy of the future of our society, and not accepting defeat. Because when Texas does change, and it will change sometime, the whole political balance of the United States will be affected dramatically. So I would say you want to think about organizing at all levels, but don't leave out state politics. It's really, really important. State governments across the South are taking the Supreme Court decision and using it to ban the DEI programs, to do all kinds of negative things. That's what happens with Supreme Court decisions. They expand beyond the particular decision. There needs to be resistance. People need to get off their rears and show up. And to, you know, when right after Trump was elected president, we happened to be in Austin. And the women turned out, it must have been 100,000 people, just in the very first days of the Trump administration, and raised hell. That made a difference. That set the stage for taking over the Congress 2 years later. You know, think about those things as well as what you can do in your office or in your institution, because it matters. The states have fundamental control over higher education and over public schools.
I would reinforce what you're saying by saying that the regents of the University of California were appointed by the legislature.
After the political changes.
Right. And so that's how we got a very powerful decision, was by voting in people in the California legislature who would go on to be naming the regents. So step by step.
Well, and just how do we build people within higher education and within our institutions that will take that kind of responsibility, either protesting or taking up leadership in their own institutions? And so just using a couple of examples, I think part of what we need to do is change the way we structure power within the classroom. So that people start taking responsibility earlier on for their own education, and so they're not passively receiving. So taking, you know, the Meyerhoff program, doing this at the undergraduate level, creating small cohorts of people who are expected. Number one, understanding that the reason people weren't succeeding in science is because they were being taught in ways that were making them into passive people who, if they didn't do well, were going to drop out. To shift that, to change the way in which people were engaging, so that you have cohorts of people who are investing in each other and who are also expected to do have some kind of positive impact in their community, and then building out from what worked, creating small groups of people who were initially, these were for black boys and black girls, and then expanded to be people who care about diversity, and having that then be the driver of a kind of institutional transformation at the level of the institution. So I think we have to start in the way we structure classrooms and the way in which we structure teaching. We did this also in the law school, to really integrate. I think part of what we're going to need to do, since we can't simply say we're doing this with race as a plus factor, is to integrate the question of why race matters to everything that we care about, whether it's health, whether it's the justice of legal institutions, whether it is being able to succeed in the sciences. Every aspect of what we care about in democracy is affected by whether people of color and people who are currently excluded are participating. And for us to be able to move forward in our education, we need to equip people to understand that, to practice it, and care about it. And I think we need to do the same thing. You also asked about this with respect to our leaders. I guess the example that I have there comes actually from the court system. You know, my fictionalized character, but coming from a real court system is, a judge who basically every day walked through a system that was systematically treating people of color in a way that he would never have tolerated if that were his family, his kin, et cetera. And he was a person who cared a lot about justice, but he was basically anesthetized to actually even noticing, let alone doing something that would transform. And he had defined his role as a judge. Think professor, think teacher, think administrator, to say, listen, I just call balls and strikes. The fact that most of the people appearing before me are one race and we are another, that's not my job. The fact that we are treating people disparately in the way we're charging them, or the prosecutors doing this, that's not my job. And then he went through a process of really connecting with a group of people he didn't usually interact with. Most of the judges were white. He didn't interact with the court clerks, the interpreters, or the people who came before the court system. He went through a longer term process of actually having interactions on a regular basis where he would have to face the consequences of not taking that kind of responsibility, of hiding behind roles to fail to take responsibility, which I would say we do in the academy as well. I'm just a professor, I'm just a researcher, I'm just an administrator. It's not my job. But he had to face the consequences of, he didn't even realize his black judicial colleagues were being stopped by the police in the same ways that he had never heard those stories. And in that process, connecting that to having to do things, that's something else that I think we need to do, is it's not enough to understand them, but we also have to take responsibility for what we do. So I had to start saying, okay, what's your experiment for the month? You're gonna come back and have to report to us about what you've done, to act on what you've learned. And this started to build a cohort of people who were actually going to take responsibility for transforming the way the judicial system was treating people within the system and also people who are appearing before the court. And I think we need to think about organizing, not only in the political process, but organizing within our own institutions. This is going to take an organizing effort that we need to really take a different kind of responsibility for the things that we have just accepted as the way things always are. And that's going to happen by this kind of systematic organizing at every level of the institution, and then holding ourselves and our leaders accountable for sticking with that over the long haul.
The judges and the people who are running the courts come from a different world, and they really don't understand. I actually took a judge who was a very progressive judge to visit some public schools. Turned out he'd never been in a public school in his life.
Right.
And when he would be walking through, he would say, "Gary, where's the such and such?" And I said, "Your Honor, they don't have that." Where's the such and such? Where's the crew team? They don't have that either. He was deeply moved. And I've seen very, very conservative judges gradually face the reality of what the society is like. And one of the things I think is interesting right now is we have a lot of judges of color appointed by President Biden. For years, the conservatives have been going to one judge in Texas and getting crazy injunctions, worldwide injunctions. There's going to be some really progressive judges that you can go to and think about how you can create some new law. It won't be easy at all, but it's really important. And those ideas do flourish it takes a long time, but
Yeah.
It can be done.
But I'm not sure how good we are about helping students, particularly students, to understand how incredibly important the judicial system is.
Yeah.
And how when you're voting for a president, you're voting for the person who's going to be appointing a whole lot of judges that are going to affect your life.
One of the things that was interesting after the Dred Scott decision, which said slavery could be imported to every part of the United States, and slaves didn't have the right to be on courts, what brought Abraham Lincoln into national politics. But what they did after he became president was they just started passing laws that undermined that decision. And the court was afraid to overcome them, overrule them. So we have to think about not just passively accepting these things. In the long run, we need some strategy to overrule and limit them.
I will say one of the most inspiring panels that I've been on recently
Yeah.
was one where there were high school students who were the ones who were mobilizing this kind of transformational work, and then another one with people who, I've done a lot of work with people who have been affected by the criminal legal system. And that's where I think I feel like our responsibility is, first of all, our privileged students who, have, first of all, they don't recognize right next to them are people who have not had that privilege and have to go through an institution like Columbia that's set up as if everyone has, a lot of resources, and so I think opening up the space for the people who are directly impacted, the ones who have managed to overcome these various obstacles, and having really equipping them. I feel like many of us, our responsibility is to create the support and the spaces and the room for them to be driving this kind of transformational process, this kind of opening the eyes of the people who have power, so that there will be an urgency around this kind of change.
One thing about policy, if you study policy, is it never ends at one point. It's a river, and you want to completely try to change that river at all levels if you're really concerned about something like this. And be willing to be embarrassed by people who say you're raising issues you shouldn't, which is, both Patricia and I had that experience constantly in our universities. Oh, you just want to talk about that again. Well, yes, I do want to talk about that again, because we haven't solved it, folks.
Okay, I'm going to try to have time for one question, because I have failed at my job, and I was supposed to make people stop at 7. But as you can see, the conversation was too interesting. So we'll have one question, and then I promise also that you can ask folks questions afterwards, not in the big setting. If you have other questions for our panelists, you can come up, because we have a little bit of time for a reception. So one question from the audience. Yeah. I think they would like you to go to have a microphone. They'll bring you one. And you should identify yourself before you ask your question, please.
Hello, thank you so much to this panel. I'm Dr. Brooke Johnson. I am a preceptor in the Office of DEI, doing a teaching postdoc. And so my question is, really, like, what is affirmative action? And like, was it, like, I'm a Rice alum and now teaching here and as a postdoc, and really thinking like, okay, did I benefit from affirmative action? And what would it have, how would I know if I benefited? Is it because I'm Black? Ultimately, if it did change or shape classrooms or like make learning more interesting, like, or if it did like reach its goal, like how do we, like, what is the evidence that we see that it was effective, and really like how, like, and why, if it was very effective, like, why is it being, is it precisely because it was effective that it's being rolled back? Or was it effective, was it not effective, that's why it's being rolled back? Or was it because it was effective, that's why it's being rolled back? Okay, so does that kind of,
Yeah, sure.
okay, makes sense.
I can start that discussion. Up until the time affirmative action started in the middle 60s, the leading selective colleges in the United States had 1 or 2% students of color. They weren't there. They were not there until there was a decision made that we actually have to have different outcomes, that we actually have to have critical masses of students of different racial backgrounds to make this work. And that's true. You look at the statistics, and they weren't there. They've been excluded all through history of the United States up until the time of the Civil Rights Movement. They never got represented in terms of proportionate representation, but there were very marked changes in the percentage of Black and Latino students in almost all major selective universities in the country. So it did make a difference. And when it was stopped in the 9 states, typically the public system became less integrated, significantly less integrated. So it made a difference in terms of it happening, and it made a difference when it ends in terms of it declining. And what it is, I used to run the admissions committee at Harvard Grad School of Education. We would sit around the room, and every file was read by like 10 people, including students, and we had a diverse admissions staff. And we would have people on the committee that would recognize talents that weren't evident in something like a test score. I mean, we had a tremendous range of test scores that we admitted to the doctoral programs. And we did a scientific study of it, and we showed there was no correlation between the test score and the actual performance in our program. There was a zero correlation. We tried it all kinds of different ways. So we were doing this, which had negative consequences for students with poor preparation, but we were not taking into account that students who have poor preparation, when they get to a place that has rich opportunities, they really can make very fast progress. So you can't know that when you just look at the paper record. But if you have people on the admissions staff and the admissions committee who recognize what it takes to be a Black student or Latino student in Los Angeles or Detroit to come up with what they've accomplished, it makes a huge difference. It makes a huge difference. And if we can't think about that, it becomes more difficult. We have to think about all kinds of roundabout ways to get at the same issues.
I think it's also there's a really interesting book written by Ira Katz-Nelson that's called When Affirmative Action Was White. And that is about how the GI Bill actually excluded, without naming race explicitly, but excluded people of color and immigrants as well from benefiting from the GI Bill. And this could be done, if you're the one writing the laws, this could be done without actually having to name race. So then you think about affirmative action the way it was originally conceived, and it was basically, if you think about it, affirmative action. What does that mean? It means, okay, we've been living in a society that has explicitly excluded people of color, not only from education, but from materially benefiting from things in our society. We need to do something we can't just say, okay, we're gonna stop explicitly taking race into account. We need to do something to make it possible for people to participate fully. So that's how affirmative action was originally conceived. And as Gary has said, that affirmative action has operated so that people who could thrive could succeed in education would be given that opportunity with race taken into account as a plus factor, or taken into account in ways that it would actually shape the kinds of experiences that someone came into a situation with. When I was teaching, when affirmative action had not been contested in this way, I had my students of color asking the same question that you're asking. Did I benefit from affirmative action? Should I have benefited from affirmative action? And then asking the question, should I be here? And what was absolutely clear was that the kind of stigma and racialization, at least I think, that had nothing to do with affirmative action was shaping the way people were thinking about and experiencing affirmative action. That was a stigma about race and racism that was shaping the way people were looking at whether these particular factors should be in some way delegitimated when all of these other factors were not being delegitimated. So I want to, yes, the Supreme Court has now made it more acceptable to question the way in which race is being considered, but I really want to resist that. I mean, I think there's anyone who's taught in a homogeneous class versus a class where people come in with different racial backgrounds, class backgrounds, experiences. I mean, Scott Page's book talking about various kinds of diversity and how that increases our ability to solve hard problems. But what are the hard problems we're facing? So many of them implicate race. How can we solve these problems? How can we address these issues if we don't have the people who have that experience and knowledge and wisdom in the room? So I'm so glad you asked the question, and I think it's really incumbent upon us not to allow the Supreme Court to be the one who's defining the terms, even though we're bound legally by what the Supreme Court says we cannot do, that we have to resist the way in which the Supreme Court has framed all of these issues and continue to claim.
And when you talk about framing,
Yeah.
I think language is terribly important. One of the things that just made me crazy when we were going through this in California in the mid-90s was the use of preferences, the term preferences, that students of color or people of color were getting preferential treatment. That wasn't the case. Well, we were considering race or background as part of the whole package, but it wasn't a preference that was given to them. And yet that was used to get a lot of people to come out against affirmative action. Well, it's not fair for them to, get a preference over my son or daughter. But language is important.
Yeah, and just along those lines, to say one of the things that I think is going to be really important for us is really figuring out, this idea of our linked fate, which is a term that has been used really to talk about why Black people come together from different classes and backgrounds to view themselves as having shared interests. And I think we as a society, it's going back to Earl's point about democracy, I think our fate as a nation, as a world, is dependent on our understanding how issues of race really affect all of us, and if we don't think about how we can come together around addressing these kinds of challenges as we become a majority-minority country, that we are all going to experience the impoverishment, not to mention failure of climate change. Like, this is critical and getting very concrete about that. Why do we need to move from prestige to purpose in our higher education institutions? Because otherwise our higher education institutions are not going to have legitimacy. This is all important to me, for not just, it's not only about people of color, it is about all of us. And so we have to find the language to make that really clear.
When I went to the University of Virginia as an assistant professor, there were 0.4% Black students in a state that had 30% Black young people. That did not change until the Civil Rights Act passed and affirmative action was adopted, and it's now much more diverse racially, and it's produced Black leaders and others of great importance. But it was extremely isolated. One of the Black graduate students that I was advising said to me, he said, "Professor, every time I say something in seminar, everybody's looking at me." And I didn't want to say anything to him because everybody was looking at him. He was the pioneer. He was opening up something. There was a Southern history professor there at Virginia that wrote a piece on the thing in the book that was cited by the Supreme Court. And one of the things he said, I'm a leader of Southern history. I've been writing important books for a long time. He said, in seminars, before we integrated the university, there were many questions that were never raised. As soon as we had Black students sitting in the room, there were questions about Southern history that had to be raised. And that's just such a good example of the enrichment that you get from diversity.
Okay, so because I did fail at my job, we're over time, and I want to thank everyone for your patience with my failure at my job. I appreciate this great question and your attention, and I want to thank our panelists for some really positive, enlightening, thoughtful comments. So I appreciate that, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight.